You're listening to Central Global News, where we aim to provide you with a short summary of some of the most significant international news. This week, we'll be talking about the G7 group's plans to tax multinational companies, a discovery of graves of indigenous children in Canada that caused outrage in the country, and protests in Hungary against the new campus of a Chinese university. On Saturday, finance ministers from the G7 group of wealthy nations agreed on a landmark deal that aims to make the biggest multinational companies pay more tax in all countries they operate in. The deal has two pillars: to make the companies pay tax in markets where they make large sales despite minimal corporate presence, and to set a global minimum corporation tax, which is yet unprecedented. This minimum is set to be at 15% of the profits. Among the targeted companies are giants like Apple, Microsoft, Google, and Facebook. However, some experts expressed concerns that Amazon might not be affected by the deal, which would only apply on profit exceeding a 10% margin for the largest and most profitable multinational enterprises. Although Amazon is one of the biggest companies in the world, in 2020 it had a profit margin of only 6.3%, way above the 10% margin mentioned in the deal. Protests and a nationwide outrage broke out in Canada after the recent discovery of the remains of 215 Indigenous children who used to be students of Canada's largest residential school. Boarding schools like this in Canada were part of the government's forced assimilation policy during the 20th century. Many Indigenous parents were legally forced to send their children to these institutions where they had to abandon their native languages and culture and convert to Christianity. Thousands of children died in the residential schools, and many of them had been buried in neglected graves. But to this day, the number of children who died, the circumstances of their deaths, and the locations of many graves remain unclear to the public. The children whose bodies were now discovered buried in unmarked graves were students of Kamloops Indian Residential School, which used to be the largest of such institutions in Canada, operating between 1890 and 1969. The findings caused an outrage and anger in the country, calling for further investigation. In many cities, people created makeshift memorials to mourn the students whose bodies were never returned to their families. In a protest at Ryerson University in Toronto on Saturday, the statue of Egerton Ryerson was toppled. Ryerson was a historical figure who is deemed one of the architects of the Canadian residential school system. The university's president said the statue would not be restored or replaced after the toppling. In Hungary's capital, Budapest, thousands of people marched to protest against the government's plan to build a Chinese university campus in the city. On Saturday, people walked through Budapest to the building of the parliament to express their opposition to the building of a campus of China's Fudan University. The university is one of the most prestigious higher educational institutions in China. Its campus in Budapest is said to be its first site within the European Union. However, according to a Hungarian research institute, 2/3 of Hungarians do not support the plans of the construction, which is estimated to cost about 1.5 billion euros. This amount is more than what the government spent on the entire Hungarian educational system in 2019. A loan of 1.2 billion euros for the costs would be provided by a Chinese bank, which also sparked outrage in many Hungarians. The right-wing Hungarian government is trying to build close connections with China, which is also shown in their decision a few weeks ago to block an EU statement that would have criticized the treatment of Hong Kong by China. On Saturday's protest, Gergely Karácsony, the mayor of Budapest, supported by the opposition, gave a speech as well. A few days earlier, Karácsony announced changing the names of the streets where the Fudan campus is to be built after the victims of China's human rights violations in order to protest against the Prime Minister's efforts to build a closer relationship with Beijing. New names of the streets include Free Hong Kong Road, Dalai Lama Street, and Uyghur Martyrs Road. Thank you for listening. Join us again next week.